This is my fourth novel, and it follows a biography. And as such, it was a new venture. And I started it with a young character in his 20s, a young Catholic boy who's had nothing to do with the Jewish community, who's invited out of the blue to be a cinematographer for a Jewish Holocaust survivor who's doing his interview for the Shoah Foundation. And this is something that my father went through in the late 90s, and I've set it around that period. And the young character himself is coming into something which is somewhat comical, somewhat lighthearted, and somewhat seeming a little trivial, in fact. The series of events that follows is a bit of an outsider looking at these strange people and their strange behaviours. And it leads on to a sort of more serious book where we actually meet the major character of the book. The book's called Ein Stein. There we are, a promotion. 2 words, and the 2 words relate to the fact that Stein is the surname of the main character of the book, and Ein is one, and it becomes his nickname at some stage in the book. I won't tell you much more about it, except to say I run both of those characters through, and the young character eventually becomes 20 years older, and I tried to portray the fact that young people these days have multiple opportunities, and he's gone from being an impoverished wedding photographer to a major career change, and his life has changed. And Mr. Stein, who was 90 at the beginning of the book, has naturally passed on. I was fortunate to have an interesting family around me when I was growing up. And both parents were Holocaust survivors, and as such, our immediate friends of the family were also all Holocaust survivors. And in fact, I at one stage probably believed that virtually every Jew in Melbourne had come through the Holocaust. We had some remote cousins that were interesting people. 2 of them were the Wiener brothers, Bono and his brother Pinchas, who were instrumental in the foundation of the Kadima Center and the Holocaust Center, and were very strong and fervent Bundists all their life. Another cousin who would, they'd meet at family functions and there'd be much haranguing between them, was a very strong communist who arrived before the war to Australia, served in the Australian Army, and all this part of the family grew to be quite elderly, and there are characteristics of all of them in my Mr. Stein: the Bundists, the communists, and the elderly survivor. It was neither, actually. I've always enjoyed using a camera. I wasn't all that enamored with the optics, and probably, like most people, didn't quite understand what an f-stop was or what an aperture was. But I've always been known to be the person with the camera. My interest in the Leica story, which comes out in this book, was that Leica is a German manufacturer, and being the son of Holocaust survivors, it was always my intention to avoid buying German products where I could, and I've never, for example, driven a German vehicle. So when we had to buy a microscope for our operating theatre, the choice of Leica came up, and I did some investigation, and lo and behold, I found that Leica was somewhat like Schindler, a person who actually rescued Jews during the prior to the Second World War, and did some work during the Second World War as well, and is on the border or boundary of a righteous Gentile. So, you know, not really either of those have dictated my interest in ophthalmology, but probably ophthalmology took me to the story of Leica, which I've introduced. One of my favourite authors is Erik Larson. I don't know if you're aware of him. He's a person who tries to write his books as they read like novels, but they're based as factually as he can by taking historic documents and recreating conversations and scenarios. And the last one I read was Dead Wake, about the sinking of the Lusitania. And I think some of our audience will have read In the Garden of the Beasts, which was set in the 1930s when the Americans naively sent a very naive Southern American professor to be the ambassador to Germany. And he thought he'd use that time to write his definitive book about the Confederacy, without realizing that he was going to be surrounded by Nazis and Nazism, and many interesting things happened. So I've, in all of my recent books, always tried to put a very factual basis into the story. And it came to me that I really wasn't in the position emotionally, and I don't think I even should be in the position emotionally to write about what happened in the Holocaust without having been there. Now, I know that our generation, and there's virtually no one left of the previous generation who were there, is going to have to confront that if they're going to be writing fiction. But there's been some very uncomfortable fiction written recently where people have romanticized the camps and done things that I think are very inappropriate. And there were many other things that happened during that period. And in writing my previous book, which I have here, My Sackful of Memories, which was a biography of Zvi Lewin, my in-law. Zvi and his family escaped east, and as such were not there during the Holocaust, though of course members suffered. And it made me realize that there were people who went in different directions. A lot of them went east. And in my current book, Ein Stein, I've taken my character in a different direction completely. And that might be a bit of a surprise, but I think a novelist is obliged to provide surprises to keep a book going. And it wasn't such a stretch because the characters that I surround him with are all real. I've developed a set of characters which makes him rather like Zelig in that Woody Allen movie, where he seems to be appearing at the right time, at the right place. And I know that's a bit of a criticism, but on the other hand, I think it's not improbable. And so I wrote it to inform of a different way of looking at what happened to people during the war. It's not that he didn't suffer. I think we'd all agree that he suffered in many ways, but he had a different war experience, and that happened. I had a bit of a concern because, without giving too much away, the main character has portrayed himself as a Holocaust survivor, which is where that shower interview at the beginning of the book started from. And we realized that not all of his story was true. Again, this comes from writing the last book, where Zvi had a series of memories that he carried with him through his life. And in investigating from other witnesses and from the history books, it would appear that some of those memories were displaced in time and place. And so I think memory can be faulty. And I thought I'd create an unreliable witness as my main character, not necessarily a fraudulent one, but an unreliable one. And in telling his story, I believe we get some sympathy for his situation, and I believe it sort of worked for me. My father was the only survivor of his family, and he searched for relatives after the war, and there were some people who had left before the war, and there was one in Canada and one in possibly Uruguay. My mother had her sister and these cousins that I've mentioned the Bundists and the communists. And as much as we tried to track them down, there isn't a lot of family. So I've never really had the motivation to do genetic testing. But the reason that the genetic testing came up in this book was that after writing the last book about Zvi, Zvi's father had a half a dozen, I can't remember the exact number, I think it was a half a dozen uncles and aunts of the generation prior. And the assumption was that they all died in Treblinka with his father and with that family. And a cousin from somebody who'd gone in the late 20s or early 30s to America, and that cousin decided to do genetic testing. And so with great surprise, an entire family has been found in the United States, comprising about 200 relatives. And it would appear that some of those 6 brothers and sisters had also left the town of Bielsk-Podlasky near Bialystok in the 1930s and managed to escape, and they were not known to each other. And so there we are, 75 odd years after the war, discovering relatives. So my simple answer is no, I haven't done it. And my answer after having answered this question is I'm now going to do it.